This morning in Rome, Pope Francis canonized 7 new saints. And the 2 most prominent among them were Archbishop Romero and Pope Paul VI. And with the canonization of Pope Paul VI, I'd like to take a moment and look at what that signifies. In the 20th century, we had 4 popes canonized and 1 beatified. St. Pius X, Blessed Pius XII, and then basically 3 pontificates in a row. St. John the 23rd, St. Paul VI, and St. John Paul II. John Paul I, of course, was only pope for 33 days and didn't have a chance to really make anything of an establishment to be able to consider there. So basically, in the last years of the 20th century, we were governed as a church or overseen by 3 saints. And of course, it's very difficult times, and God sends us great saints and great leaders when we need it the most. And Paul VI had to be strong at a time when things were changing all around. As you know, he succeeded St. John the 23rd and had to continue the Second Vatican Council, bring it to its conclusion, and implement all of the changes that the Second Vatican Council wrote about or instituted. And he will be most known, of course, and most remembered for his encyclical Humanae Vitae, which is 50 years ago now, on human life and talking about the dignity of marriage and human sexuality, everything that he did. And, of course, the most important thing, or the most memorable thing, shall we say, about Humanae Vitae was that the Pope reaffirmed the Church's teaching against artificial contraception. And that deserves to be looked at for a moment, because 100 years ago, the thought of publicly espousing artificial contraception was unthinkable. We've always had ways to do it. The ancients had ways to avoid conception, but to publicly espouse it would never have been thought about until by the time of Paul VI, when he wrote it in 1968, and of course even to today, it's basically a given in society. What happened to change it all? Well, it started with Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Not for any sexual reason, but because she, like her father, was a eugenicist, basically believing there are some people who have good genes and other people who have bad genes. Her father very much praised Adolf Hitler because Hitler very much espoused the eugenics argument. And she looked around at the crowds of people, especially the new immigrants coming into America, and she saw they were having large families, and she decided that these people, she had her own list of all the people who had the wrong genes. And she advocated forcibly sterilizing anybody that she felt did not have the proper genes, because otherwise we would pollute the gene pool for America, and in her own words, we would be a nation full of imbeciles, and that was the word that she used. Of course, society never caught on to or never accepted forcibly sterilizing people. Then she said, well, if we won't forcibly sterilize, then anybody that's not fit for reproduction should be taken basically into concentration camps out in the Midwest, where they would be prevented from spawning. And that was the other word that she liked to use. And of course, that didn't work either. But she was successful in advocating birth control, trying to get people to use it, and not for any charitable reason, but simply because, as she said at one point, 8 generations of imbeciles is enough. And she said, more children from the fit, less children from the unfit. That is the purpose of birth control. And it caught on a little bit here and there, but it only really blew up into, or took off wonderfully during the sexual revolution. I don't mean wonderfully in a good sense, but powerfully. During the sexual revolution of the 1960s, when all of a sudden society somehow got this idea that sexual activity is the be-all and the end-all of happiness, and that's what's going to make everybody fulfilled. And so you had to have as much activity as you could. And artificial contraception now would be a way that they could have all the activity they wanted and be freed from the burden of childbearing each time. So they wouldn't have to worry about having a dozen kids each. And it very quickly became popular and became the norm in society. And with all of that, Pope Paul VI sat down to write Humanae Vitae, and people knew he was going to write it. And the world was pretty much figuring, when Humanae Vitae came out, there were going to be radical changes about marriage and sexuality and birth control and all that, because they figured the Second Vatican Council had changed so much. It was a new church. It was a new dawn. Everything was going to be different. And they were waiting and ready for him to come out and say, okay, now it's okay. And the reverse happened. Instead, he reaffirmed the clear and consistent 2,000-year teaching that artificial means of contraception violate the very dignity of the marital act and the nature of a marriage and are intrinsically evil in themselves. And of course, the world was horrified at the thought. And many people left the church. They said they were expecting that the Pope was going to say, these are the 1960s, they were saying, the church has to get with it, has to modernize with the time. This is what people want. The church is not giving it to them, so I'll go to some church that will. And the Pope wasn't naive. He didn't think that they were really going to love it. He knew very well what the reaction would be. But he did what he knew he had to do. And one thing that the world has never quite understood, when we talk about infallibility, does not mean that the Pope gets to make it up as he goes along. Sometimes people think that as long as the Pope can just say whatever he wants, and every time a new Pope comes along, they think, oh, now a new Pope is going to come in and change all the teachings and allow this and that. Well, he can't do that. That's not his job. The job of the Pope is not to make it up. He doesn't make truth, he discerns truth. And his job is to preserve the deposit of faith, the teachings, the faith that Jesus gave to the apostles that has been passed down from century to century, and preserve the truth and keep it from being altered into something other than what it is. And whenever new issues come up over the centuries, the job of the Pope and the bishops is to sit down and look at each of these new developments and see how it relates to the gospel. Is this something permissible, or is this something that draws us away from our call to holiness, from our union with God? And to claim that a moral teaching can or should change simply because people don't like it, if the Pope were to come out and do that, well, he would not be defending the deposit of faith. In fact, he would be doing a great disservice, because our job is to be formed in union with Christ, and the gospel and the Pope, as the defender of that, is supposed to teach us clearly and consistently what leads us to union with God. And if we were to all of a sudden come along and change a moral teaching and say, well, what used to be sinful is now okay, that would imply a very change in the nature and essence and existence of God. And that's a metaphysical impossibility. So moral truths can never change, and they never will. And of course, faithful people in the church knew very well that Paul VI would hold the line on the church, but other people didn't understand that. And even though people left the church and it started, the big exodus and all the things that were happening, he knew what he had to do, and he did it anyway, even though he was called every name under the book, anti-women, anti-family, anti-this, anti-that, anti-progress, you name it, they called him every name imaginable. But he remained faithful in spite of the criticism of people. And Paul VI, most of us are pretty familiar with. We know a lot about what his life, because anybody my age or older, we grew up, he was Pope when we were younger. But the second great saint that was canonized today, we may not know as much about, and that's Archbishop Romero. Oscar Romero was made the Archbishop of San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador in Central America, in 1975 by Pope Paul VI. And El Salvador at the time was really in a mess. Like many of the Central American and Southern American countries, it was being ruled by a military junta. And they ruled with an iron fist. And anybody who didn't agree with the government, well, they just quietly disappeared or were tortured and assassinated. And there was no arguing with the government at all. Oh, they put on a show of democracy. They had elections, but sometimes there was only one candidate you could vote for, and the elections were rigged, so it really wasn't the freedom that we have here. And the power that was fighting to overcome or overthrow, shall we say, that extreme right government was a communist force, an extreme left group. So you had an extreme left fighting an extreme right. And in the society, in the culture, or the economy of the nation, you had other two extremes. Extremely wealthy people and extremely poor people, and very little in the middle. And anytime you have two extremes, you know it's not going to go well for the common person. And of course, in El Salvador, that's exactly what happened. In the middle between all of this tension was the church, somehow trying to keep peace, somehow trying to see what they could do to make things better, to alleviate all of the problems. and it wasn't an easy thing to do, and there was no unanimity in how to go about it. Some people had espoused the fact that over the centuries, the church has often been the peacekeeper, and they said without the church there, everything would fall into chaos. So the presence of the church in society was mediating things and moderating them and quietly just try to keep things from breaking out into total chaos. And that certainly can be said. There were many times in history that the church was the peace force that kept things from blowing up into a full-scale war. But then there were others who said, no, the job of the church is to speak up for those who are poor and downtrodden and the people who have no voice to speak for them. And we have to speak up for the innocent. That's part of social justice. And that certainly is true. The church does have that as part of our social justice. So there was no unanimity among the bishops and among the clergy of El Salvador about how to go about it. And Romero himself even went to Pope Paul VI and about what he was doing, his approach to the whole thing. And he said that on June 21st, 1978, he had a meeting with Paul VI, and Pope Paul said to him, I understand your difficult work. It is a work that can be misunderstood. You need to have a lot of patience and fortitude. I know that not everyone thinks like you. It is difficult in the circumstances in your country to have that unanimity of thought. However, proceed with courage, with patience, with strength, with hope. So he encouraged him to try to make a difference. And in the beginning, Oscar Romero was, first of all, they thought he was a nice compromise candidate for the Archbishop. They thought he would be quiet. He, by his own admission, was a bookworm. He was not very much knowledgeable of the social things and the politics that were going on. And he was trying to do things very quietly. And people right away accused him of being a wimp, of sitting back and doing nothing with all of the suffering that was going on among the people. But that changed, because one of the problems he had there, even within the church, was some of the people who were pushing for the church to have that active role espoused liberation theology, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And liberation theology had basically two branches to it. One was good, the other was not. The good branch of it said that it is the right of the church to speak up, or the obligation, the duty, to speak up for the poor, as we just mentioned. And Oscar Romero certainly espoused that. But there was another branch that said, given the situation in El Salvador as it is, it's gotten to the point that we really have to do that with violence. And so there were many priests, mostly Jesuits, but a few others, who were advocating taking up the sword, getting guns and fighting the government. And they gave fiery homilies calling upon the people to stand up to the government, to fight back. And of course, the government did not sit back lightly and just ignore it and say, well, they have freedom of speech. Anytime these priests were celebrating masses, and they were often open-air masses, they would be there with cameras, taking pictures of everybody who was there. And anybody who was there and going along with the priest, they would be taken out at night and tortured and killed and just disappeared. Many times people never saw them again. And they were disappearing by the thousands upon thousands. And only 3 weeks after Archbishop Romero became the Archbishop, a good friend of his, Father Rutilio Grande, was murdered by the government for speaking out as a radical liberation theologian. And when he saw that and realized that other priests were even being tortured by the government because of what they were doing and being accused of being communists, he started to realize what was really taking place. And he went down and looked more closely at exactly what was happening. And that changed him. He realized he had to take a more active role in trying to free the people from the tyranny and the repression and the torture that was taking place. Even as unions tried to rally together and demand a better wage, well, the people who led them were just taken out and tortured and killed. I mean, that's the way, sadly, the situation was. And he decided his best way to address it was with the pulpit. And his homily every week, he would address the situation in El Salvador, and he would have it broadcast, radio broadcast, throughout the country. They say 80% of the people in the rural areas were listening to him, and 35% of the aristocracy faithfully turned into him each and every Sunday to listen to his message. And he never sided with one political party, never said specifically anything against the government. He just called for peace and called for an end to the terror and for people to settle their differences peaceably and to not go out and destroy, torture, and kill people who disagreed with the government. That was the only thing the only way he spoke against the government. Wasn't calling for its overthrow or anything like that, just calling for an end to the violence. And, of course, the government didn't like that, and he received numerous death threats. But he was unscathed, he was uncowered by it all, and he continued the message. And the more they threatened him, the more he got stronger and stronger. Finally, on March 23rd, 1980, he gave his most powerful speech. And this time, his homily was addressed directly to the members of the military, because this was a military junta that was involved, that was running the country. And of course, anytime the leaders wanted somebody out of the way, they sent the soldiers in. And this was a Catholic country, so it was Catholic soldiers killing their own Catholic people. And so the Archbishop appealed directly to the soldiers in a very bold statement. And this is what he said to them. He said, "Brothers, you came from your own people. You are killing your own brothers. Any human order to kill must be subordinate to the law of God, which says, 'Thou shalt not kill.' No soldier is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God. No one has to obey an immoral law. It is high time you obeyed your consciences rather than sinful orders. The church cannot remain silent before such an abomination. In the name of God, in the name of the suffering people whose cry rises to heaven more loudly each day, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression." And for the government, that was the final straw. The very next day, the Archbishop was celebrating Mass in an infirmary, and he finished his homily and went to the altar to continue the Mass, and a red car drove up in front of the chapel, and a man came out with a rifle, shot one bullet perfectly into the heart of Archbishop Romero, killing him instantly. His funeral was attended by a 250,000 people came out to mourn him. And even his funeral was not peaceful. Even that was interrupted with smoke bombs, with snipers, with all sorts of violence. And ultimately, El Salvador entered into a full-scale civil war between the left and right that only ended in 1992 when the United States finally was able to broker peace between the two and got them to put down their guns and allow the communists to be a political party where they would fight with their mouths in Congress rather than with guns in the street. But it's still a very dangerous situation today. El Salvador has the highest murder rate in the world, and it's listed as one of the most dangerous countries in the world. So there's a lot of work to go there, certainly. And Archbishop Romero saw what he had gotten into. He knew what was happening, and he knew he had to be strong. He could have sat back and just done nothing, but when he saw the plight of the people, he said, "No, in good conscience, I cannot do that. I have to defend the innocent. God will expect me to do that." And he paid for it with his life. You and I today, hopefully, probably will never be asked to pay for our faith with our bloodshed. But like Paul VI, like Archbishop Romero, we do have to be strong in defense of the truth of the faith, reminding all people that God is calling them to union with Him, not to more of the world's pleasures and possessions. As he told the rich young man in the gospel today, leave it all and give it to the poor and follow me, and you will have heaven. That the purpose of the church is not merely to make people's lives better here and now, but lead us all to heaven. And we must not lose sight of that. And of course, as Archbishop Romero had reminded us, that violence is never the answer to any situation. And as Jesus said, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. But that doesn't mean that we have to be wimpy and sit back and just take whatever is thrown at us. We have a duty to defend people, to defend our faith, to defend anyone who is being downtrodden, mistreated, abused, denied their right to life, their dignity, whatever it may be. Yes, we have a responsibility to do that. And in our world, as you know, our country is getting culturally and socially more and more polarized. And we are in the middle, I believe, of a cultural civil war. And things are only getting worse all the time. And while it may not come to violence so far as guns are concerned, if you have noticed in the news, there are people now actively calling out for violence to people who disagree with them, kick them while they're down and upset them and yell at them, and all sorts of even threats of harm against certain politicians and their families. So that's alarming. It's alarming to see that we might be going down a path such as that. We need to be the peacekeepers. We need to be calling people to reason, to respectfully disagree, and not to be threatening violence against people who disagree with us, but at the same time not being cowed by people who would threaten us, whether they threaten us with losing our tax exemption if we speak about unpopular things or anything of that nature. Not by any means that the church should side itself with any one political party and say the Catholic Church is part of this party of that. Of course not. We never want to do that. But inevitably, when we preach the gospel, it will collide with politics, because that's just part of the nature of what politics and our faith are. And when that happens, we do have a duty to speak up and defend people and preach the truth, charitably but firmly. And may we always do so remembering the great example of the two new saints that Pope Francis canonized today, Archbishop St. Oscar Romero and St. Paul VI. May Jesus Christ be praised, now and forever.